The future is a future where more and more financial services are going to be served on chain, and where the tokenization of assets is just something that will continue to grow. And we believe that people will still want to get things priced in their local currencies. And so we want to make sure that there's basic building blocks for the DeFi on-chain world that is in tune with kind of like consumer expectations, at least in the geographies where we work. And so an example of this is, we obviously have companies in Mexico or institutions in Mexico that offer credit. They offer credit to you in Mexican pesos, and people earn in Mexican pesos, and then they want to repay their loans in Mexican pesos. And so we would just expect, at some point to be able to, for more people to want to get on-chain loans, but to want to get those on-chain loans in MXN peso, in MXN, right? MXN denominated. And so for that, you need like an MXN stablecoin.
This is Money Code. It's a show where we decode stablecoins and programmable money. I'm Chuk, Okpalugo, your host and author of Stablecoin Blueprint, and I'm here with my co-host Raj Parekh, head of stablecoins and payments at Monad. Today, we're going to get into what it takes to scale stablecoins in a cross-border payments market landscape and the ecosystem at large. We're joined today by Daniel Vogel, co-founder and CEO of Bitso. Bitso is the first crypto unicorn in Latin America, but more importantly, they now handle 10% of all US to Mexico remittances. It's a clear sign that stablecoins have already moved from speculation to essential infrastructure. And as they explore local currency stablecoins for the Mexican peso and the Brazilian real, Bitso is betting that the opportunity lies in cross-border utility. So if you're looking to understand the realities of stablecoins' role in the future of cross-border payments, Daniel is the person to go to. Dan, thanks so much for joining the show. How are you?
Chuk, Raj, very good. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me, and excited to tell you a little bit about what we are doing.
Excellent. So before we dive in, a quick note. Money Code is brought to you by Stablecoin Media and powered by BVNK. The views and opinions of the host and guests are their own and may not represent their companies. Nothing we discuss today constitutes investment advice or any other form of advice. Okay, let's dive in.
All right. Well, first off, excited for you to be here. Bitso has been, in my opinion, one of the most important companies across, LATAM, and Vogel. We've always had a chance to work together for many years now. But maybe describe just what is Bitso today? How did we get here? Because I think it's a really, really interesting story with lots of different paths, and I think you guys have been around for almost a decade at this point too.
I'm originally from Mexico. I was living in San Francisco, and a friend of mine told me about Bitcoin. This must have been about 2010. I went back home and I kind of like read up on Bitcoin, and I was just fascinated. Like what is money, and who gets to decide how much it's printed. And I used to always love working late at nights, and the guy who was basically the cleaning staff at the company where I was working for in San Francisco was also from Mexico. So we would just talk about like whatever, whether it was a World Cup, whether it was Mexican elections, whatever it is. We just connect on anything Mexico related. His name is Julio, and Julio one day just asked me for money. Hey man, would you spot me $300 and I'll pay you at the end of the week? I was like, sure, Julio, but I've known you for a number of years now, and you've never asked me for money. Is everything okay? And the guy just said like, look, I need to send money back home, and there's a very big fixed cost, and so my daughter needs some school utensils pretty urgently, and if I send her what I have, a big portion of what I send will be eaten by the fixed fee. But if you lend me the money, I'll get paid in a few days and I'll pay you back. And even though by this point I'd already been in the US for maybe like 7 years, like I'd never really understood kind of like the pains of remittances and how expensive they were. And I just found it fascinating that, you could press a button and you could basically FaceTime anyone or video chat anyone, but basically at no cost. But that moving money across borders was very expensive. And my two co-founders of Bitso, Ben and Pablo, they were also individuals who were not living in their home country. And I think the three of us just kind of like were fascinated by this idea of Bitcoin as a mechanism to move money between borders. And so a big part of the impetus of starting Bitso was actually to like move money across borders. We need to replace Swift and correspondent banking and all these really old infrastructure and just build out new infrastructure. And we thought Bitcoin was going to be the answer. And in fact, before starting the company, I actually tried to build a different company that was going to send remittances from the US to Mexico via Bitcoin. But there was no way to make those Bitcoins liquid in Mexico for pesos. So people would receive them and they'd be like, how do I buy medicine and how do I pay for, utilities with this thing? And that's what made Bitso as an exchange, which was kind of like the very first product that we launched, very obvious. We just needed a mechanism to make Bitcoin liquid with Mexican pesos. We were definitely one of the first people to actually really start moving money between the US and Mexico at scale using Bitcoin. And so then our second product was, we had a lot of customers who wanted to invest in Bitcoin or in crypto in general, but the notion of the order book was just a little bit too complex. And we just built a broker, which we thought was just going to be an easier experience. All mobile, come here, we'll give you a price and just buy in and sell whatever cryptocurrency you wanted. And so that was, I guess, kind of our second product. And in many ways, it's still the largest product that we have from a revenue perspective. But then our ambitions was always to build like these cross-border stuff. And so we just kept trying and we tried many different things. And it really wasn't until kind of like stablecoins got to a specific critical mass where we were able to really start growing the infrastructure to really like finally do that original vision that we have to just replace the correspondent banking and cross-border money movement rails that have existed for a long time, but were slow and inefficient and only worked during specific times. And we just started to basically move money between countries using stablecoins, using USDC, USDT, and that has grown. And so even though we do about 10% of the remittances between the US and Mexico, there's about $60 billion that flow from the US to Mexico every year, and we do about 10% of that. But our TPV right now as a company on cross-border payment stuff is close to $80 billion a year. And so it's larger than the remittance corridor. And now we power a bunch of other stuff. Companies who are trying to make payments, individuals who are trying to make cross-border payments. We obviously do a bunch of the remittance stuff. And we handle treasuries for corporates, and basically like Bitso has kind of like started to become what we call kind of like the largest digital asset infrastructure provider in LATAM. We allow companies to build on top of us. Everything's built on APIs, and we have also end customers. We believe that money should just be digital. It should be programmable. It should live on a blockchain. And we want to make sure that we connect the banking rails of Latin America with the crypto rails that are global to be able to basically facilitate these cross-border transactions between individuals, businesses, and across countries. But we still have a fairly large business that is basically the brokerage, where stablecoin is also important because a lot of our customers just want to buy dollars, and access to dollars in LATAM is a big business. But it's more of an investment or savings app, whereas what we've been building on the B2B side is more like really infrastructure to do these payments at scale, both from a liquidity perspective and then from a payout and pay-in perspective.
That's fascinating. It's incredible to hear the story, and I think it's really interesting how the original vision was cross-border payments. And I think it's actually similar to many other companies in the crypto space. Circle, for example, everyone knows Circle as a stablecoin issuer. My first interaction with Circle was they had an app. It was a consumer app for cross-border payments. It was a global Venmo. And I was telling all my friends to get it. And I was like, guys, this is the solution. This is how it works. And they kind of shut that down and then pivoted a couple of times. And now it's who they are. But so many people in the space were brought by the initial Bitcoin solution, that promise, but it's taken us many different places and times to get there, and stablecoins are part of that solution. And so I want to dig into one of the things you mentioned. I guess, two things. One was you were trying all these different things, and it just took some time before the market was there, and what lessons that holds for other corridors where you kind of need to wait for liquidity, you kind of need to wait for some critical mass, and then maybe after that you can kind of break down an 80 billion of annualized TPV. How much is remittance? How much is cross-border? Which corridors? Just to give everyone an understanding of like how scaled you guys are at this point.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny to hear you say, you were trying all this stuff, because we really were trying all this stuff, right? And it was interesting. We were always able to find like a few set of customers who were very intrigued by this. Like I feel like there's people around the world who've been paying attention for a long time, and who were kind of like willing to be part of that journey, And so like from remittance companies all the way to very traditional companies who've been customers of ours for, by now, like Raj said, like basically a decade. And but a lot of other stuff just wasn't there. Like the liquidity wasn't there, the technology wasn't there, the even the regulatory stuff. You could still argue that part of that is still not even there today, to really just kind of like really unlock the full potential of what we think is going to happen. But like we still feel like there's a little bit more regulatory clarity that is needed. So like I guess some lessons along the way is like you can have a lot of fun, but if this would have been our sole business, we would have been out of business for a really long time. Like we were very lucky that crypto as an asset class grew, and that we had the investment side on the retail product, because that broker like really has funded a lot of the R&D and a lot of the patience that we've had to have on the cross-border side. The second thing that I would say is that we were this kind of like company in Mexico, and we had all these US companies that we were looking up to, and I guess like another lesson was like, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are, like you can still innovate, and you can still be like pioneers. And there were times that we're like, oh, maybe we should just like grab the playbook of one of these players that's being successful and just copy it, right? And that's has worked for a lot of companies in like across the world. I mean, we've seen the Uber competitors that then get bought by Uber, or the whatever, right? Like this happened in a bunch of industries. And like the largest tech company in Latam, which is Mercado Libre, if you talk to the founders, we have, Nico Secasi is in our board, and he's told me a lot about the early days at Mercado Libre, but it was basically like a copy of eBay, right? And then it became, a very large competitor to Amazon in the region. But so you can build very successful businesses like that. But we also feel quite proud that we kind of like innovated a lot in this space, in the cross-border space, just by the sheer kind of will of trying and retrying and just having a lot of fun while doing that. But we would have never been able to do that had we not had like something that was actually paying the bills and bringing in money and had a growth story. The next thing that I would say is that, at least when it comes to innovating in financial services, I think you need to get very comfortable with innovating in slightly gray zones. Yeah, I think like one of the things that we did at Bitso is we had very clear things that we never wanted to do, right? Like we never wanted to do, deal with nefarious actors or with actors that were using our platform for questionable purposes. But that doesn't mean that even if you have like a very legitimate client, that you can fully build out a fully regulated, with full regulatory clarity solution on the get-go, because regulators, they don't have an incentive to regulate something that might become important, right? Like they will play catch up. That's just in any industry, that's true. But financial services is so regulated that it's tricky. It's extra tricky to build here, because you need to learn how to kind of create the space where you can have enough compliance, or be following kind of like the spirit of the law with enough conviction that if someone asks questions, you have very good answers, but where you can actually where you can actually be innovating. So that's been a lot of fun. We've had a lot of fun doing that. Very stressful at times, but also always really interesting. How do you negotiate with regulators? How do you position yourself, et cetera, which is still true to this day. And then the last lesson I would say, at least the last lesson that comes to mind, is that the team is really important. A lot of the a lot of the vision, kind of came from me and Ben and Pablo as founders, but a lot of the really awesome stuff that like we've developed as a company has come from the team, right? Like people who you get to really buy into your vision, get really excited about what you're doing, and who can really, be showering and thinking, how am I going to make this better? And a lot of the really awesome innovation comes from those folks. And so, just very grateful for the people who've been part of the Bitso journey for, at any point, but definitely the ones who have been there for a really long time. Very, very grateful for them. In terms of like the 80 billion of TPV, so our largest operation continues to be Mexico. And so in terms of that volume, Mexico is the majority, then it's followed by Brazil, then Colombia, and then Argentina. From a B2B perspective, our retail business is slightly different. Retail business, Mexico is also the biggest, but Argentina is number two. And the majority of the flow today is basically PSPs. And so these are companies that sell solutions to merchants and customers, etc., to basically process payments. But then they also help these companies move the money in or out of a country. And what we found is that these particular companies are pretty badly served by the TradFi world, and they can become really competitive if they can basically figure out mechanisms to hand the money they collect on behalf of their merchants to the merchants quicker. And before they had to wait a bunch of time, right? Because you would collect a bunch of money and you would let that money sit or accumulate until it got to a certain mass. And then you would basically do the FX conversion and then wait a few days for that to clear through the traditional banking system. And then you would deliver it to your merchants. And now basically we have merchants that every single payment that gets collected basically gets converted into USDC or USDT or some stablecoin and just gets shipped directly sometimes to the merchant, sans the commission of the PSP. And so it's kind of really starting to change PSPs, but PSPs has grown significantly for us. Remittances has been a little bit of a mixed story. We grow at times and then we shrink, and what happens is remittances is such a competitive game where margins on FX really, really matter, that I think the flow that we have is really interesting because these remittance companies have high capital cost constraints or high working capital costs, because they need to pre-fund these accounts. And so these remitters go and they make they enter into a partnership with a payout company in Mexico, but the payout company is happy to do the payments for them and charge them as long as they have money sitting in the account. But if it's if a international transfer takes one business day, that means that you need to send money on a Thursday to front your operations for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And you need to have basically 3 full working days of working capital. And sometimes big important holidays or days happen on a weekend. And so then these companies were really struggling with just the high cost of all the working capital they had to put in. And our solution is 24/7. And so they love it. And they love it for overnight, for nights and weekends, because they basically can lower the amount that they keep at these payout partners, and they can just top them up whenever they need to. And the solution is very simple, right? The solution is they have dollars in a bank account in the US. There's a bunch of providers in the US that will receive dollars and turn them into a stablecoin, send over the stablecoin at Bitso. Bitso gives them good pricing on liquidity. They turn that into MXN, and then we can send that to anyone, whether it's the end customer that's receiving in their bank account or a payout partner that needs to receive that in their account in order to continue to make payments. And so just to answer your question, from the 80 billion that I quoted, I would say probably 75% is Mexico, and out of that 75%, I'll tell you in just a second, pero out of that 75%, I would say about 10% of that is in the remittance business, and the rest is a combination of PSPs and corporates that are basically using this for to just basically move money between countries.
That's fascinating. I think many people just assume it's mostly remittance and don't really have a good understanding of the B2B side, but those B2B flows are enormous. That's huge.
Yeah, no, and they've been growing pretty significantly over the last year. I think the stablecoin story has been a very powerful one in 2025, and we see small, medium, and large enterprises who are all curious, and we see different levels of engagement. But I mean, Raj will know this well, but the large payment networks, Visa and MasterCard, thinking really hard about how do I make of stablecoins an opportunity for our business, and remittance companies and corporates. So we see a lot. There's still a lot to be done. I think one of the biggest issues that we still see today is just like tax. There's still a little bit of uncertainty with respect to Mexican tax code, for example, on how do you really treat a stablecoin. I think as those things get cleared up, the solution is just so much better, so much faster, that our sense is that just more and more and more people will just continue to get onboarded, and over the next 10 years, we're going to forget about correspondent banking and all that crazy stuff.
Yeah, no, it's bold. I mean, and also appreciate you breaking down the 80 billion in TPV. I mean, that's pretty massive as well. And it seems like, and you guys obviously haven't stopped there. I mean, you guys have also released your own stable coins too. So you have MXNB, you have BRL1, which is the consortium in Brazil as well. But maybe describe just the motivation of saying, okay, we've seen this business grow. We're seeing the flows and volumes kind of stack in multiple different directions. We know that you guys have a strong foothold in Mexico, but what then led to, hey, we should actually release MXNB, and what are you seeing so far in terms of use cases and interest for it too?
Yeah, so when we see the USD stable coins, right, we see them fulfilling some important customer needs. So I'll talk about some. As I mentioned, people in Latin America, depending on where you are, it might be easier or harder to get access to a US dollar bank account. And some of these stable coins just make it very easy, right? As long as you have access to a place like Bitso, you can very easily onboard into stable coins. So that's exciting. The second thing is we're seeing stable coins be a really important building block of the DeFi world, right? Everything that has to do with exchanges on-chain exchanges, getting loans, collateralized loans, all the stuff that's happening on the kind of on-chain world. USD stablecoins are a really, really important building block for that. And then the third thing that we see a lot is what I was just talking about, all the incremental kind of cross-border / settlement flows, whether you're settling a credit card with Visa or whether you are settling a remittance with Bitso using a USD stablecoin. And so kind of as we start to think about the future, right? We don't think that there's going to be a big appetite for, let's say, Americans to hold MXN the same way that there's an appetite of Mexicans to hold USD, right? Mexicans have been holding USD forever. Very few Americans hold MXN, right? So that kind of use case, we don't think necessarily really applies for MXNB or BRL1. However, the other two we find very interesting, right? We are firm believers of the on-chain economy. We believe that the future is a future where more and more financial services are going to be served on-chain, and where the tokenization of assets is just something that will continue to grow. And we believe that, people will still want to get things priced in their local currencies. And so we want to make sure that there's basic building blocks for the DeFi on-chain world that is in tune with kind of like consumer expectations, at least in the geographies where we work. And so an example of this is, we obviously have companies in Mexico or institutions in Mexico that offer credit. They offer credit to you in Mexican pesos, and people earn in Mexican pesos, and then they want to repay their loans in Mexican pesos. And so we would just expect, at some point to be able to, for more people to want to get on-chain loans, but to want to get those on-chain loans in MXN peso, in MXN, right? MXN denominated. And so for that, you need like an MXN stablecoin. But then as we think about this kind of like cross-border payment space, we also think that over time, more and more of the liquidity is just going to move on chain. And we believe that because there's real benefits to just having pricing on chain and FX on chain and settlement on chain. And so, if for some of the audience, this is like a little bit difficult, you can just kind of like think about it as, you used to have kind of like these local magazines that would cover stuff, events and whatnot, and then the internet came, and then there was like these global venues where we cover, information and events, etc. And like it changed forever media in Mexico. When I was a younger kid, I would basically, the media I had access to was whatever the Mexican media decided that was worth showing me. When the internet showed up, I suddenly could access information from all over the world. I always use the example that my favorite band is Radiohead, and there was never anything in Mexican media about like Radiohead. And the internet came up, and I was able to connect with like-minded individuals all over the world and really learn a lot about Radiohead. And it was amazing. And I feel the same thing is going to basically happen with all these on-chain stuff. On-chain being another analogy or another concept similar to the internet, but you can think about it, it's just going to bring financial services or solutions or products to everyone. And you're going to be able to access, a loan on chain that is going to be more competitive than what your local bank would offer you. And you're going to be able to basically do that on this technology. And so when we think about FX, we really feel like at the end of the day, liquidity will beget liquidity. And so you will want to have more liquidity in these pools that are going to be more visible, more transparent, more discoverable. And that needs to be in an on-chain venue. And so MXNB and BRL1 become really important building blocks. And by the way, there's already a really interesting amount of activity for MXNB on chain and for BRL1 as well, particularly on on Avalanche. And then the last thing is like, when I moved to Mexico, I moved back to Mexico. So I'm from Mexico, but then I spent 10 years in the US, and then I moved back to Mexico. And when I moved back, there was this new payment system called SPAY, which is the system that connects banks and financial institutions in the country. And I thought it was kind of cool. Like, oh, you enter this number and you make a payment. And then I was like, when we were starting Bitso, we're like, oh, we should become a participant of SPAY. And that journey took us like 7 years to basically get to, maybe not 7, but no, yeah, probably 7 years to basically do it. And the amount of innovation that's happening on SPAY, it's minimal because it's such an important part of infrastructure run by the central bank, very regulated, very difficult to be a participant, very expensive. We were actually talking to a bank recently who's like, I don't want to be a participant of SPAY anymore. I'm going to offload that to a third party. But the point that I'm trying to make there is that I feel like it's very difficult to innovate even in local payment systems, payment rails. And I want to believe that there's going to be a really interesting set of innovation that'll happen with local stablecoins, way as it relates to kind of like local payments. And the reason why I feel that is because right now you have like explosion of fintechs in Mexico, but they all have to have this really difficult moment connecting to the space system through third parties and whatnot. And I feel like if there was like an easy tech-enabled solution on chain that we're trying to obviously build with MXNB, we would just basically start seeing a lot of innovation there where people are going to start thinking, oh, I no longer need to go through this like super hard and difficult system to get onboarded, but I can basically innovate on top of like a stable coin. And I think we're going to see cool stuff for local payments as well, with new experiences that today cannot get built on top of SPAY, but could get built on top of on top of these local stables. And so that's kind of like our vision. We believe that payments will just need like any other asset, local currencies will need to be tokenized. That will make them play a very important role in the DeFi world, and we believe that new use cases will emerge as more and more companies kind of like start playing with the idea of, oh, maybe I can just use a stable coin as opposed to these archaic, really complex systems.
That's really helpful to hear. And it almost is a parallel of earlier in the Bitso's life where you were very aware of the opportunity for Bitcoin and blockchain to facilitate cross-border, but you're trying all these different things to make it happen. Does it feel like you're in a similar position where you can see the future is happening, but you're trying to do all these things? And what do you think is needed? Well, is it liquidity? Is it regulation? What are the ways to get that liquidity on chain, or to get those markets of borrowing and lending of MXNB versus Bitcoin?
Yeah, so you hit it spot on, Chuk, because it's kind of like the end state is so obvious, but I have no idea how the hell we're gonna get there. And so we're just trying all these things, right? Like, and actually, I just had a meeting with my whole management team, and we were just literally talking strategy, and we were talking about like, we have these products that we know that there's demand for them today, and then we have these ideas that we know that that's how the future is going to work. And how do you basically run a company that allows you to fund these longer, these longer initiatives, right? Because when you fund them, like, and they're successful, or even if it takes you, half a decade or a decade, like it's very rewarding, right? Like that you were able to kind of like see the future, and not only see the future, but like you kind of had you were able to shape it, right? Because people have used the story of like the cross-border payments that Bitso has done for a really long time. Like if you see, anyways, I'm not gonna get into that, but some of the litigation that's happened in the U.S. like actually quotes as a real positive side of crypto, this cross-border stuff that we were doing. But I guess like the way that I think about it is I think you need to be very stubborn with the vision, but then you need to be very flexible on the details. And I'm pretty sure someone else that's smarter than I am said that already. And so I'm just copying. I forget who it was. But it's something that I really, really take to heart at Bitso, because as I mentioned before, some of the real breakthroughs happened when the team was just innovating by themselves. And I'm kind of hoping that the same thing happens here, where some of the things that are the big blockers today, like regulatory, liquidity, even just frankly speaking, technically, right? Like now we live in this world where like we've created hundreds of chains and a bunch of layer twos, and as opposed to liquidity be getting liquidity, we're fragmenting liquidity, and that has its own set of issues. And so like as an industry, we're also going through the Cambrian explosion of ideas, but a lot of them just need to die, right? Like a lot of them just, frankly speaking, I mean, just survival of the fittest. Many of them just cannot survive. Well, they will not be able to survive. But it's confusing. It's confusing building today in crypto, because there's so many, and you get approached by all these players like, oh, release MXNB on my chain and I'll give you X or I'll give you Y. And so you do some of these things, but then they don't really end up where you want them. But I guess if I had to sort of summarize, I think the three things are regulatory, where I think the US is leading the way with Genius and Clarity, etc. But when it comes to cross-border flows, you would also depend on the other countries. Mexico, I think, did a very, very good job in 2018, and now it's been really lagging behind. The second place, I think, is liquidity. And liquidity is always this chicken and egg problem, because we can inject a bunch of MXN liquidity, but if no one is using it, it just becomes very expensive to just have that liquidity sitting there. And so then, you don't necessarily want that. But then the opposite is true. People go in and say, oh, well, there's no liquidity in this market, so I don't want to. So you need to figure out these mechanisms to really kind of get that flywheel started, no? And so on that front, we're trying a bunch of stuff and partnering with a lot of really interesting companies and protocols, trying to basically get MXNB to just be, more widely used and more liquidity. And then the last thing I would say is the technology itself. I think blockchain technology has gotten significantly better, right? Like trying to do this with Bitcoin, very difficult, slow, volatile, etc. We did this with Ethereum for a long time, and then transaction costs got really high, but now they're kind of back. And now you have the scalability of these layer twos. But then there's these questions around privacy. There's questions around anyways, but I feel like all of these things are going to get sorted out, right? And so I'm not particularly worried. I was looking at this chart that someone sent me that basically was showing the daily transactions per second in the Ethereum ecosystem. And it's just fascinating, right? Ethereum is doing close to 400 transactions per second. And not long ago, we were thinking that it was impossible to think that this thing was going to even scale beyond 7 or maybe 10 transactions per second. And now we're doing 40 times that of actual volume, not even this is not the limit of the network. It's just what's already happening on the network. And so I always find those things so the technical aspects of crypto so interesting, because we move very quickly, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the infrastructure has gotten so mature now where you can actually build some of these, these payment systems and not have to worry about the unit economics as much, or network congestion. Some of the abstraction is also just getting much easier from a user experience standpoint too. So I'm very excited about what's to come as well. But I'm also curious, Vogel, for you, we tend to go through these hype cycles in crypto, and we tend to see it a lot. And stablecoins obviously had a really big year recently. But are you seeing the market, is it overhyped right now? Is it underhyped? Or are there things that are still maybe still getting built, kind of to your point, that you're still excited about? But curious to your point of view. There seems to be new companies that are popping up every single day now. This consolidation also, and the market's evolving very quickly. But curious to see your point of view on it too.
I mean, it's really exhausting building crypto, right? Because as you mentioned, you go through these hype cycles where everything's super exciting and everyone's becoming all their businesses are booming and everyone's making a lot of money. And then as fast as you got there, then you're on the opposite side of the spectrum. The narrative changes from crypto is going to solve for world peace to this is just a scam industry, right? And my dad, when I was younger, I remember this really well. I graduated from college in 2009, but my dad came to visit me at the end of the school year in 2008, and I had a roommate back then whose who's going to become an investment banker, and whose job was kind of in questionable standing, because the great financial crisis had just happened, and all these banks what made hires maybe the summer before suddenly weren't ready to maybe commit to those offers. And my dad told this guy in front of me, he said, just trying to make him feel better, he said, life is like a wheel of fortune. Sometimes you're on the top and you can't believe it and you feel like you're the smartest person in the world, and sometimes you're at the bottom and you feel like you're the stupidest person and blah blah blah. And my dad said, but that's just life, man. You just go round and round. And what you need to remember is that you're not as smart as you think you are when you're on the top. But when you're on the top, you should enjoy it, because you're for sure gonna come down. And equally, you're never as dumb as you feel you are when you're at the very bottom. And all you need to remember is that at some point it'll just go back up. And I've kind of like taken that. I think it's very appropriate with the crypto industry. And I kind of like really try to think hard about that when as we run Bitso. Um, and but I will tell you that like yes, the market obviously gets hot and there's a lot of investments and a bunch of companies, and a bunch of those companies will fail and some of those companies will be very successful. And we see some companies that are like, growing very, very rapidly, but when you really dig into the unit economics, it's like how is this going to become a business? And so that's kind of hard. Um, but I think that the two lessons that I think are important here are the following. One is that I welcome every dollar that gets poured into the crypto space because that's just another team trying something else, um, and it's just like an opportunity to have a breakthrough, an opportunity to innovate, to disrupt, etc. And then the other thing that I would say is that in the same vein, um, valuations might get too hot or get penalized a bunch or whatever, depending where you are on the hype cycle. But I still feel like we have not accomplished what we should accomplish. And so I feel like the path forward is definitely going to be circuitous, definitely going to be difficult, but there's so much opportunity and there's so much upside. And there's so much to build that I think if you have the opportunity to kind of like build in this space, in this environment, I would absolutely be doing it and invest. Now the question is at what prices, where we are, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like those are kind of like secondary. I want to believe that, even if evaluations are just a little high right now, the companies that will end up kind of like figuring this out and winning are going to be worth multiples of what these current valuations are. And things that at times look expensive, I think over time, if they're successful, will look very cheap, right? I think that's true of anything, but I feel like it's very true for where we are in crypto, because particularly when it has to do with kind of like disrupting the rails of the traditional financial sector or traditional financial system, there's just so much to do still. And the rails are never ending, right? Because we just talked about like correspondent banking, but there's rails in everything in the financial system, right? Like credit card acceptance and or credit card processing, and like local rails, and then these global rails and the messaging systems, and like settlement, like when you buy a stock in Mexico, then you need to go in and settle with these depository institution. I don't know what the translation is in English, but like the ability to just kind of like take flows and disrupt is just like not ability. The market for money movement is just so massive, and you look at what crypto is doing, and yes, it's grown a lot and it's exciting, and there's all these amazing metrics like the stablecoin TPV in 2024 surpassed that of Visa and MasterCard combined, and like we should be very proud and excited about that. But man, it's still a drop in the bucket when you look at what the TradFi world is really doing. And so I just feel like if you execute well, it's just up from here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said. The opportunity when you break things down, as you mentioned, and you get into the weeds of what the customers who are coming to you are saying and just lived experience. One of the things that you said that really I was surprised by was even SPAY, the local market payment rail, has issues. And yes, it's there, it exists, but the friction to develop is holding back the economy, is holding back innovation and startups and so on. And if you can remove friction and allow people to bring together innovation, build on top of each other's products, i.e. composability, then you just move faster, move forward a lot faster. And so, yes, I think I can see why some folks get a little bit jaded, because it seems like we've been doing this for it has been over a decade, right? It's taken ages, but actually I think now is a moment where we are so close to like a breakout point. I think regulation is starting to trickle in. Yes, the hype is helpful sometimes because it allows you to think big, but we're seeing it happen. It's happening. You guys are in the middle of it, and others are too. So I'm excited, and I think there's just, you got to dig deeper into the actual understanding of payments, banking, capital markets, and blockchain. It's not easy stuff, but once you dig into it, the opportunities are there. So very excited, and I'm hyped, and I'm looking to build myself. So as we close out the show, just want to ask you for a couple of questions here. What does success for Bitso look like in 5 years?
So I always, this is kind of like one of those questions that, every time in my career where I ask myself that, like it really changes, because I think the thing that really ultimately motivates me is like just creating impact and just seeing the crypto revolution just take hold, whether it's as an asset class and convincing people to invest in it, or whether it's like really rigging the new kind of like payment infrastructure locally and globally. But it always changes, right? Like I remember when we first raised cash, and I was like we just deposited, the money was just deposited into the account. And I remember sitting there looking at this whiteboard with my co-founders and telling them, like, guys, you realize that in order for us to like live up to this valuation, we need to do this much activity on the platform. And it just looked impossible. It just looked impossible. And because if you would have asked me then, like, what does success for you look like in like 5 years, I would have said, like, well, I don't know. We have like a few clients that like, really like these solutions that we're trying to build. I don't know. And it's just kind of like every time it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I think for me, like over the next 5 years, the things that I really, really want to see are better bridges with the on-chain world. Like all this stuff that I was talking about, like stablecoins being a building block for the on-chain world. Like we see the on-chain world is growing a lot, but it's growing a lot with a fairly still small set of customers. And I just want that to grow. And like we're seeing some awesome stuff, like, some companies that are doing the DeFi mullet approach, where they have they present themselves as a company and you open an account with them as a company, but then they're using kind of like DeFi on the back. And so I feel like that's exciting. But I really want to see that just grow massively, because I really want to see this vision of like the global financial products that are locally accessible play out, particularly because I'm from a part of the world where there's very little competitiveness in financial services. There's very shitty access. There's like all these kind of like problems. And I would love nothing more to see some of the Mexican banks are some of the most profitable banks in the world. I think they're the most profitable banks in the world. And it's because like a lot of them have been these very big, almost monopolies. And I mean, they're obviously not a monopoly because there are multiple of them, but they kind of behave almost like one. And I'm just so excited to see competition, and to see competition in an angle that I think they're underestimating. And that gets me very, very excited. And if Bitso can play a big role in allowing customers to access these products, whether it's FX, whether it's lending, whether it's whatever, but if we can be an agent, like an agent for change, or a mechanism for individuals to really access these, this world, I think that would be very, 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 like, that's kind of like one of the things that I really want. Ultimately, what I really care about is just impact. Like, I just want to help people and businesses have access to just more competitive and better solutions. And I think if we can continue to scale our business, that'll be good success for us.
Throughout the show, you've already kind of dropped a lot of kind of builder advice. Actually, what would you say is your a key piece of advice for like a budding entrepreneur in the space who's trying to move the world on chain as you're doing?
Yeah, look, I would say I think my biggest advice is like, if you're building in this space, you're likely touching the money of someone, whether it's a company or whether it's a customer. and you're not only representing you or your company, you're representing this entire industry. And so my biggest piece of advice is, if you do that with care and you do that with responsibility, you stand a much, 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 much better chance of success than, if you just don't do that. And you will significantly hurt the industry, right? We've seen sadly a lot of bad players, and I'm just honestly really tired of them. And so just want to see more legitimate people with not only good intentions, but who are willing to be, responsible and be held to account, just building in this space.
Yeah, here. And then finally, last question. What are we not talking about enough? What should the industry talk more about?
I mean, this is so interesting because the industry is just so large, right? And depends on who you ask. Like, I feel like there's pockets everywhere of people who are hyper specialized on things. I already touched on this, but I really feel very strongly that the Cambrian explosion of chains is, I think, net negative to the industry. Just like the Cambrian explosion of coins, I still feel was net negative for the industry. Like, there's obviously room for more. There's obviously room for improvement. There's obviously room for innovation. And we've seen the most successful coins from an investment perspective be successful, particularly because they wanted to do something very, very different, right? Like, if you think about Bitcoin versus Ethereum, very, very different value propositions, right? But how is Bitcoin and Bitcoin chain? Well, I'm gonna get into issues here, but Bitcoin Cash, like, how are those really different today? They're not that different, right? Or Litecoin, they're not that different. And we created a lot of this stuff that ended up just being noise and ended up just really diluting, I think, a lot of the narrative of the space and making things just a lot more complex. And my sense is that the multiple chain world is doing that. And so, like, if you're thinking about innovating and creating a new chain, like, you need to have a very, very, very good reason to do so. Otherwise, I would just think of these things as like public goods and try to just build on top of them. And I say that because I am seeing liquidity get fractioned, like just get fractioned a little bit too much to my liking. And I feel like if we just had everything in a smaller set of venues, like, we would actually be able to have a lot more liquidity and build a lot more stuff more effectively. And I don't feel like this is having enough of a conversation, except for like people in Reddit and X who complain about like, oh yeah, now this company needs its own chain. Okay, great. But I feel like as an industry, we haven't really gotten together and said, okay, folks, do we really need everyone to have its own chain? And if so, if the answer is yes, then like, what are the things that we're going to build to like pull liquidity across chains and make them be a lot more interoperable or whatever. But my sense is that there's actually not that much room for so many chains unless there's like, significant innovation that takes place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a few teams who are trying to solve that cross-chain single liquidity pool, as you mentioned. It's hard enough trying to bootstrap local currency stablecoins and tackle all the various different experiments. And so, yes, I think that's a key thing that we could spend more time on in the industry. So that's great. That's a really, really helpful way to round out. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel. Where can our listeners go to find out more about you and Bitso?
Yeah, so they can follow me on X. I'm Vogelito, and on and Bitso is just at Bitso. And then the last thing that I would say is, like, if anything around stablecoins was interesting to you, we are putting together the second iteration, I guess the next iteration of our stablecoin conference in June 15 and 16th of 2026 at the World Trade Center in Mexico City. There's going to be programming on that front, and it'll be sandwiched between World Cup games in Mexico. And so we would love to welcome your audience to come in and join, because last year we had an amazing event and turnout, and we would love to see more people, building and getting excited about the stablecoin industry.
It was easily one of my favorite conferences of the year. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it next year as well.
Thank you, Raz.
Great timing. And Raj, what about you? Where can folks go to find you online?
Yeah, you can find me on X at rparekh and mana.xyz.
Excellent. And for me, it's stablecoinblueprint.com, or on X, Chuk_XYZ, or on LinkedIn, Chuk Okpalugo. This has been Money Code. Thank you so much, Dan, and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Chuk. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks so much for listening to Money Code. There was so much to take away from today's conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too.
If you enjoyed this episode, do us a favor, share it with someone you know, or give us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. Until next time.